Okay, welcome back from the break, everyone. And remember to keep dropping comments and questions in the chat as you think of them. Next up, we're going to hear from Jay Hyland, the archivist at Jewish Museum Milwaukee. Jay Hyland has been the archivist at Jewish Museum Milwaukee since July of 2004. He has a bachelor's in history and English from the University of Wisconsin River Falls and a master's of library science and history from the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee. As JMM's archivist, he coordinates the museum's oral history project and conducts research for genealogists, researchers, and scholars. Take it away, Jay.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thanks for having me here today to speak to all of you. It's great to be here and share some information about the museum and our oral history project. So as far as how my talk is structured today, I'm just going to start off a little bit by talking about the history of the museum and archives itself, and then get into the oral history project specifically and how that has evolved through the years, along with some of the things that we did during the pandemic and in recent years. So as you'll see on the first slide, there is our current logo, the Jewish Museum Milwaukee, and a program of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, if you sort of just think of it very similar to the United Way in terms of structure, not in the not as big a scale, obviously, as the United Way, but similar in that they have the Federation has many different programs, of which the museum is one program. And the Federation's mission is to care for the needs of the Jewish people and build a vibrant Jewish future in Milwaukee, in Israel, and around the world. So if the next slide, please. This is a current shot of the Jewish Museum Milwaukee archives, the main reading room, as it looks today. And it definitely did not look like this when the archives first started back in the mid-1980s. Now, how that started was actually with the women's division of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. And they decided in 1984 to form a roots committee to go out into the community and assemble some evidence of the history of Milwaukee's Jewish community. And in doing so, they realized that in looking in-house in the Milwaukee Jewish Federation offices, that there were all of these photos of past events and people and organizations that were unidentified and had no labels, and that, you know, they were really great pictures dating back to like the 40s and the 50s, but no detail had been provided about them. So what happened is the Milwaukee Jewish Archives was created in the form of an archives committee, and they started in April of 1986. So that is the time that we look at as when the first beginnings of the actual, what ended up being the Jewish Museum Milwaukee. And this group of volunteers got together once a week to meet to identify the photos that were in this box that the staff of Milwaukee Jewish Federation had found within their offices. And in doing so, a staff person named Kathy Bernstein was put in charge of the volunteers, along with her normal responsibilities where she was working in the women's division. And so this kind of became like the archives became kind of like a pet project of hers, where anytime she could get away to work in the archives, she would try to do so. But basically the only time that she had to spend on the project in general was on Monday mornings when this group of volunteers would get together. And it was really quite an experience for her. She's remembers just how dedicated that early group of volunteers was. Next slide. So this is a shot of some of the early volunteers that volunteered in the archives. As you can see, they have a few boxes on the desk there that they're working on identifying photos. And the woman in the back row wearing the black sweatshirt in the middle, her name was Clarice Resnick. And Clarice was really the lay leader of the archives, who worked in tandem with Kathy in helping identify all these photos, and then later going out into the community and asking individuals and organizations if they had any photos or information to donate to the archives. And many of the other volunteers that you see in this picture were also involved for 15, 20 years, 25 years, really dedicated to the project overall. And as the years went on, the group continued to meet, more and more people became aware of that the archives existed and started donating more and more materials. So finally, in about 1993, the Milwaukee Public Museum did a sesquicentennial exhibit on 150 years of Jewish life in Milwaukee. And some of their collection that ended up being displayed came from the Milwaukee Jewish Archives, along with other people in the community loaning materials just for that exhibit. And the exhibit proved to be so popular that it was, I think, originally scheduled to run for about a year, and it ended up being extended and running a year and a half. And after that exhibit was finished, there was people thought, okay, what do we do with all these materials that were on exhibit and things? And so we'll donate those to the a lot of those to the Milwaukee Jewish Archives. And this was when the idea of an actual museum, Jewish museum, being located in Milwaukee started to be talked about, mainly by the two people that started that were Abe Chudnow and Bernie Peck, two prominent local businessmen in the Milwaukee community. And they came to Kathy Bernstein and said, look at all these materials that came in for the exhibit at Milwaukee Public Museum. We should really have our own Jewish museum. And it was something that Kathy really hadn't thought about before and considered. And so she liked the idea. And of course, funding was the major issue, along with several other issues. So before the funding started for the museum, the Milwaukee Jewish Archives put out a booklet about the history of World War II and the Jewish war veterans who had served in Milwaukee, of which there were several hundred. And this book contained photos of servicemen along with their shared memories of their experiences. The book was successful, and it was at that time that the Milwaukee Jewish Archives changed its name to the Milwaukee Jewish Historical Society, where they started doing more public programs, along with a few public exhibits. And also at this time, Marianne Lubar became the Historical Society's founding president. So as the new millennium dawned, work began again on trying to get an actual Jewish museum. There were a lot of stops and starts through the years, but in 2001, a design firm from Maryland came to meet with various members in the community and led focus groups, asking people what they wanted to see in a Jewish museum, what sort of artifacts should be collected, what sort of stories should be told. And so that started a initial fundraising campaign, but for various reasons, that the museum idea didn't actually happen at that time. Until finally, in 2006, the Milwaukee Jewish Federation launched a community-wide capital campaign for renovating a lot of its buildings, including the Jewish Community Center campus and the North Shore, along with the Jewish Federation building here on Prospect Avenue. And included in that large capital campaign was a new Jewish museum to be housed on the first floor here on Prospect Avenue. So on the next slide, please. And so that is a current shot of the outside of the Jewish Museum, Milwaukee. Shortly before the museum opened in April of 2008, a docent program was created with intensive training sessions, and also the Federation announced that the museum had received a $1 million endowment gift from the state of Jacob Bernheim to ensure the continuity of the museum. And just to, before I get into the oral histories, our museum mission was created at that time in April of 2008, and it still is very similar today, and it reads, "The Jewish Museum Milwaukee is dedicated to preserving and presenting the history of the Jewish people in southeastern Wisconsin and celebrating the continuum of Jewish heritage and culture. The history of American Jews is rooted in thousands of years of searching for freedom and equality. We're committed to sharing this story and the life lessons it brings with it to enhance the public's awareness and appreciation of Jewish life and culture." So as far as what is housed in our museum and our archives, we have a number of different resources, both genealogical and general historical, and also some digital resources, including that one of the big ones that's used by a lot of people is the Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle, which started in December of 1921. And that newspaper, which is still being published today, was digitized a few years ago. So we have access to all the past years of the Chronicle from 1921 through 1995 was digitized. That's available on newspapers.com. If any of you subscribe to newspapers.com, you can have access that way. Or if you'd like to visit the museum and go look through it in the archives, you normally can. Right now, because of the pandemic, we're not having in-person visitors, but hopefully sometime in the future, we definitely will. And of course, as far as and we have other records too related to organizations and different synagogues through the years. Some of the synagogues' histories date back 150 years, and it's really quite interesting to look at those early records. Now, obviously, what I've talked about so far, the oral histories certainly play a huge role in going along with both the mission of the Federation and the mission of the museum. Next slide, please. The Oral History Project actually started in 1986, the same year the Milwaukee Jewish Archives began. And the first oral history that was conducted was when Tybee Taglin interviewed Howard Weinschel. And Tybee Taglin, she and her husband Max, after they retired, they led a tour group, a tour agency that led many local tours of Milwaukee, not just tours of the Jewish community, but also tours of Milwaukee in general. And Tybee was a real ambassador for Milwaukee and involved also with our Jewish Museum and Jewish Historical Society. And in 1986, she had approached Kathy Bernstein and said, hey, we should really start beginning to think about interviewing some community members. They won't be with us forever, and we should hear their stories. And who better to be interviewed first than Howard Weinschel? This is a picture of Howard Weinschel. He is the gentleman in the middle, performing in a play called Brothers Ashkenazi. And Howard was a member of the Perift Players, which was a Yiddish theater group in Milwaukee that was founded in the 1920s and continued performing up until the 1970s. this particular play, the picture that you see here, I think this is from the next sometime in the 1950s when that was performed. But Howard had approached the archives that he had a number of different images of the Perif players through those 50 years. It was entirely a volunteer organization. And in the next slide, you'll see some different members of the group. This was just a general publicity shot they did to make people more aware of their performances that were going on. Howard is the person that is standing in the back row in the middle there. And so Tybee interviewed Howard about his life as a Jewish immigrant from Poland and about the Perif players in Milwaukee. After that time, the next 6 years from 1987 to 1993, there were a few more oral history interviews done. One of those included an interview with Belle Garfinkel. And Belle Garfinkel, at the time of the interview, she was in her 90s, but she lived to be about 110. And her husband, Harry Garfinkel, had founded the New Method Hebrew School in Milwaukee. And he was a Russian immigrant, and to help finance his education, he began giving lessons in Hebrew in private homes in the city of Milwaukee. So then after a few years, he established a New Method Hebrew School, which was a part-time coeducational school that was conducted after regular school hours and also on Sundays. So in Belle's interview, she laid out a lot of the history of the New Method Hebrew School and how dedicated Harry was to his students and what the purpose of the school was, which was to teach Jewish children about the Hebrew language and history. But the reason it was called a New Method Hebrew School was that Harry really wanted to create a learning environment where students were not intimidated by the teachers and where they felt free to ask questions, because he felt that in his native country of Russia, that kind of the teachers that he had were too authoritarian and not really didn't really take the needs of the students into consideration. So this interview by Belle was done in the early 1990s, and we've used that a number of times through the years. Also, before I move on, a fun little bit of trivia about Belle is that she is actually, her grandson is Henry Rollins, if you know who he is. So that's a little celebrity connection there. After those 4 interviews were done in the time period of 87 to 93, the Oral History Project really didn't have any happenings over the late 90s time period. I would say mainly, from what I understand, mainly due to lack of funding reasons. But in 2001, the Jewish Community Foundation, which is the endowment arm of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, received an anonymous grant for $4,000 from a generous donor to have a series of oral histories done. And this also happened to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, which had been founded in 1902. So in 2001 and 2002, there were about 30 to 40 oral history interviews done, mainly with past presidents of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation and past campaign chairs and women's division leaders, but also with some of the local agency directors and presidents, and also some older people who especially had good immigration stories and stories about the old neighborhood. One particular interview that I can think of that I really enjoy watching was done with Larry Lederman during this time. And Larry was the athletic director at the Jewish Community Center for a number of years and a great athlete. And in his interview, he talks about the old Jewish neighborhood on Walnut Street, and his recall is just amazing. Like he, literally, he pretty much literally goes house by house, like remembering where people lived and ward organization was located here, ward organization was located there, and just really takes you into the old Jewish neighborhood and what it was like. So this is kind of a really a great example of an interview that where like it's just priceless to have this sort of um, firsthand account by someone like that. After this set of interviews was done, could go to the next slide, please. After this set of interviews was done, then the next big happening where the oral history part of the program really turned around was in 2004. And it so happened that in September of 2004, the American Jewish community initiated a year-long series of programs to mark 350 years of Jewish communal life in America. And goals for this national celebration were to celebrate the achievements of Jews in the Jewish community for these last 350 years and celebrate American ideals of freedom, equality that allowed Jews to participate fully in the United States economic, political, and cultural life, and also recommit ourselves to values that unite and define people as Jews and as Americans. So as part of that, the Milwaukee Jewish Historical Society requested to do a series of oral history interviews. And this was called Capturing Our Community, Milwaukee Jewish Oral Histories. And this was a massive undertaking. And it started with a group, an oral history committee that was formed together, led by Tybee Taglin, who I mentioned earlier, and Barbara Blutstein. And this group got together and had a number of things to discuss, including the objectives that you see on this slide in front of you. And I just want to read what those are, because those have pretty much stayed constant through the years since 2004. The Oral History Project objectives include providing an opportunity for individuals to record their own perspective of Jewish living, to provide a treasure trove of Jewish memories for the enjoyment and education of future generations, to preserve the history of Milwaukee's Jewish community, and then also maybe a few less obvious reasons, such as to offer volunteer opportunities at the museum. This project not only were people coming in to be interviewed, but there are also numerous volunteer opportunities, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then also encouraging participants to donate materials to the archives at the time and now museum. And finally, highlighting a unique program of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. So this group in 2004, if we could go to the next slide, please. This is a example of a handout that people were given to be made aware of the project. It just says, Capturing Our Community, Milwaukee Jewish Histories. This spring program to celebrate 350 years of Jewish life in America, sponsored by the Jewish Community Foundation, with additional support from Marion Epstein and the Miriam and Bernard Peck Foundation. Remember, your story is our history. That tagline, your story is our history, has pretty much remained the signature tagline for our project through the years. And that was created by this committee in the summer of 2004. Now, also other things that the committee had to consider in scheduling this were what sort of questions should be asked. And the questions, people, they wanted them to be open-ended, but also questions that gone into some sort of detail. So just to give you an idea of what some of those questions are, they included, does your family name have a special meaning? Who were your first family members to settle in this country and why did they come here? How did they get the money to come here and make their living when they arrived here? Did you grow up in a Jewish neighborhood? And if so, where and what made it Jewish? And talk about your life in uh, belonging to a synagogue or any organizations that you belong to, and also discussing how your parents were involved in Jewish communal life. Those are just a few of the many questions that the group came up with to ask the people being interviewed. And then if I could go to the next slide, please. This is another, they wanted to really publicize that this was going on, this project was going on. And so this is an example of one of the ads that they ran in the Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle. For those of you who aren't able to see the text, it just says, frankly, we'd prefer the 1,000 words. Pictures can be wonderful, but they're no substitute for stories behind them. That's why the Milwaukee Jewish Historical Society is conducting video interviews. It's part of Celebrate 350 Years of Jewish Life in America. Every member of the Milwaukee Jewish community has a story. Whether it's serious, worldly, or even silly, it's part of our community, and we want to preserve it for future generations. Next slide, please. So the interview session that ended up taking place as a result of all of the work of this committee, happened in October of 2004 and went on for 2 weeks. The Historical Society was lucky enough to receive a large grant from the Helen Bader Foundation. Many of you know them now as Bader Philanthropies, which is an organization that's been incredibly generous, not only to the Jewish community, but the broader community in general. And so that was the reason that this extensive oral history session was able to take place, mainly thanks to Bader. The picture that you're looking at here is a photo of one of the interviews that went on during those 2 weeks. You'll notice our videographer there in the back, and then the person in the foreground is one of our volunteers who was called a classifier or a note taker, which we had for these 2 weeks, where some people, community members, had volunteered to be classifiers, where they sat in on the interview and would jot down kind of subjects that they thought would be important that were discussed during the interview that could maybe be used by the Historical Society for future programming needs. And then you'll see directly in front of the camera there is the person interviewing the interview subject, who is sitting in front of the plants there. A decision was also made at this time by the committee that only the person being interviewed would be on camera, not the interviewer. That decision was made mainly because the person being interviewed was the person who should be front and center and on display, and they were telling their story. He or she was telling their story, and that should be the main focus. But at the beginning of the interview, the interviewer made sure to introduce by name both of them as they were doing the interview. Another part of this 2 weeks session was the Historical Society had a training day where Linda Marcus, who was a former Channel 4 morning news anchor, came in and led a session giving interviewers tips on how to be able to conduct the best interview. So all in all, if I could go to the next slide, please. This is a ad that was put in the Wisconsin Jewish Chronicle after the project ended. And this is a list of all the names of the people who participated. And as you can see, there were many people involved. In total, 120 people were interviewed for those 2 weeks, along with 40 volunteers. And it was just a massive undertaking. Um, Speaking from personal experience, I had actually started a couple months beforehand, so this was really sort of being thrown into things that I was able to observe Kathy Bernstein and see just be able to engage and meet a lot of the Jewish community and learn different stories. Unfortunately, at the time, I couldn't help conduct interviews just because I didn't really know much about the community in general. But I was able to sit in on a lot of interviews and able to gain a lot of valued experience that way. So it was just a really memorable 2 weeks, and and just really great for the Jewish community and the oral history project. We could go to the next slide, please. And this is just after that big 2004 undertaking. This is an ad for 2005, the following year, when oral histories were done for a few days again. After the 2004 session, well, we couldn't do a 2 week intensive session like that every year. We did try once or twice every year to do a oral history day or 2 days where we'd interview more people in the community. And it just continued from there until up to the present time. Now we have about 600 oral history interviews that have been done. Before getting into the present day, more information about the present day, I also wanted to mention that in 2010, we started partnering with the UW-Milwaukee Center for Community-Based Learning, Leadership, and Research, where their students have to do service learning project of 10 to 20 hours in a semester. And our museum was one of the institutions participating. But this project actually continues to this day, where we have a few different student interns who do this service learning each semester. And what they do is work with the oral history interviews and provide detailed, they watch an oral history interview video and provide a detailed summary of what happened in the interview. And so far, they did about 250 of these. So thanks to all their work, if it hadn't been for them, we wouldn't have written information on a lot of our interviews, probably 75% of our interviews at least. So we're really grateful to be able to continue that partnership through the years. And I'll explain in a minute how that has changed within just the last year or so, but we're thankful to them. And then also wanted to mention that in 2018, we participated in the NEH funded project, Listening to War, Digitizing Wisconsin's Wartime Histories. And have to definitely thank Emily and Recollection Wisconsin for making us aware of participating in that project. I think she was the person who approached our museum about participating. And through that project, we were able to get 20 of our interviews completely digitized and transcribed. So yeah, Kristen just posted the website link for that if anyone wants to check out any of our interviews through that avenue. That's been another great resource to publicize the oral histories. Next slide, please. Now, well, everything that I've talked about so far has obviously, been great and played a big role in capturing the history of Milwaukee's Jewish community. I can't lie and say that it's been perfect. So we've certainly had some challenges through the years regarding the project, and these are just a few that are listed. Funding obviously is probably the biggest challenge. We have to pay the videographer or videographers who come in to film the interview, and as everyone knows, that certainly costs some money to be able to have to do that every time. Scheduling. There are various different things about having to do with scheduling that have been a challenge through the years. That includes space. When we first started, when we did the 2004 project, we had the entire third floor of this building open for us to do the interviews because Jewish Family Services, which is another Jewish agency, had just relocated to their own building on Jackson Street. But now for the last several years, we haven't had that space because that's all has become more space for Jewish Federation staff here in the building. And the only space that we have to do the interviews here in our building is a meeting room downstairs here by the archives, which is great for doing the interviews, but sometimes scheduling can be a challenge because we share it with other departments in the building as well. So there are different meetings and things going on, and during normal times that where we might not necessarily be able to block off an entire day or two to do these oral history interviews. Another challenge of scheduling through the years has been some missed appointments where people are people, and sometimes they forget about their interview, or maybe end up at the wrong place. And since we're paying the videographer, we have to skip the interview because we're paying for that time. And so that's been kind of another scheduling challenge through the years. Interviewers, all of our interviewers through the years have been volunteers, and many of them have been wonderful and done a great job. And because a lot of what makes an interview a good interview is the person who is doing the interview. And since a lot of them are volunteers and don't necessarily have interviewing experience, sometimes it can be a challenge. And in some of the past interviews, when we look back, and seen that the interview only ended up being 15 or 20 minutes long, when it could have been an hour long if certain follow-up questions were asked, that's certainly another challenge that we have to deal with. One thing that I did forget to mention too is that with these interviews, we only allow 1 hour for the interview. We cap it at an hour, just because that's the easiest for scheduling purposes. The one exception to that is our Holocaust interviews, because those take much longer due to not only telling the Holocaust experience, but then we also want to hear about the Holocaust survivors' experiences here in the US post-Holocaust and what happened in their lives since then. So we do allow a couple hours for those interviews. Another challenge is just staff time. Approximately 50 of our interviews have been completely transcribed, including the 20 that were digitized through the NEH project, but the rest of them really haven't been indexed in any way, which kind of limits their usefulness for researchers and others wanting to explore these first-person histories. With there only being 5 of us full-time staff in the museum, and all of us having all sorts of different responsibilities, that it's a real challenge to find time a lot of times to go into the micro details of the oral histories, even though we wish we did have more time to do so. Publicity has been another challenge. Not necessarily in terms of people who want to be interviewed. We've had a long waiting list. I think at one point it was over 200 people who were wanting to be interviewed. I think now it's about 70 or 80 people that are on the list. But publicity in terms of making people aware of the project, which oftentimes helps with help with funding and different things, and publicity also in terms of people being aware that we have the interviews through different ways. Technology also can be a challenge. Most of our really early interviews were filmed with VHS tapes. And I remember, and this I think again was around the time when I had first started in late 2004, early 2005, we were so excited because we got a grant to have our VHS tapes all converted to DVDs. And of course, as we know now, DVDs are certainly great and everything, but it might not necessarily be the best uh, long-term preservation method as opposed to the digital route. So technology is certainly another challenge. And then the last challenge that's not on the slide there, but just in general, hesitant interviewees. A lot of times there have been certain names that have been passed along to us, and we've tried to engage the person to come in, and he or she will say something like, I don't have anything to say, why would you ask me, kind of thing. And we try to tell people that there's not a single person who doesn't have something to say, and that everybody has a story. But there have been times through the years where people that we wanted to interview just have declined because they were, they're uncomfortable in telling their story, or just felt that they didn't have much to contribute or to say. Next slide, please. So how do we use our oral histories? Next slide, please. First, with school groups. We have pre-pandemic, we have a number of school groups that come into the museum through the years since we opened in 2008. And usually a lot of times the school group is focused on learning about a particular topic. And especially in the case of if the school group is learning about the Holocaust, we oftentimes like to show them a clip of an interview with a Holocaust survivor. Unfortunately, our survivors who are still around today, they're getting older and aren't able to come in and share their stories as much as they were able to in past years. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll show one of the oral history interviews that we did with a Holocaust survivor to them, and that really helps make the best, of not being able to have a survivor here in person to visit with the group. Next slide, please. Genealogy is another way that we've used our oral histories. There have been people doing genealogy research who have contacted us about wanting to see his or her relative that was interviewed by our project. We do have a list of all the names of people who have been interviewed on our website at jewishmuseummilwaukee.org if anyone's interested in seeing the list of names. But that's another way that we're able to let people know that this interview does exist, and that we can arrange for them to be able to view the interview. Next slide, please. Holocaust survivor video. This is a shot that's taken within our museum. We have a special section on the Holocaust, and this is a video of one of the Holocaust survivors talking about her experiences. And when the museum was first created, a Holocaust survivor video was put together that's about 8 minutes long, with clips of different interviews that we did over the years with survivors stitched together. So that video has obviously been seen by thousands of visitors to our museum through the years, and is played continuously for anyone who visits our museum. Next slide, please. Changing exhibits. We have a changing exhibit gallery in the museum where we have 3 or 4 changing exhibits per year, and we have been able to use our oral histories in some of the changing exhibits. These are just 2 examples here. The Pushcarts to Professionals exhibit that was done in 2013 on the history of Jewish businesses in Milwaukee. We used clips from some of the business people talking about their memories of either their father or their mother in some cases, and starting, like a small butcher shop or, being a peddler. I remember in particular, we used a clip of Marty Stein, who was the founder of Stein Optical, and he's talking about his father coming to America, and his exact quote was, "You came to America on Thursday. On Monday, you were knocking on doors selling socks and underwear." So we were really able to effectively use probably, I think, 8 to 10 of the oral histories for that exhibit. And then the other exhibit that's shown there in the picture, Allied in the Fight, Jews, Blacks, and the Struggles for Civil Rights. That exhibit featured stories, oral history that we did with Jay Larkey, who was a physician in Milwaukee that participated, that helped, who marched with Father Grappi in the 1960s in the Civil Rights Movement. And he talks about his experience as a doctor, being in the basement of St. Boniface, treating the people who were injured during the different protests and things during that time. Really a good firsthand account. And then also this fall, we're actually having an exhibit from the Jewish Museum, our friends at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, that they had created about the scrap industry. And we're augmenting it with some local components of Milwaukee scrap and Wisconsin scrap industry, because so many of the scrappers through the years have been Jewish. And we're planning on using some of the oral histories that we did in the past with some past scrap dealers as well for that. Next slide, please. And now we're sort of up to the start of the pandemic last year. And we really tried to, like everyone else, we had to adjust and figure out what are we going to do during this time. And some things that we thought about doing was, hey, can we make use of some of our oral histories? And two different ways that we did that. This first slide here, from the archives, we did a monthly program, about a 5 to 10 minute program, where we would talk about a certain artifact or family and also add in some quotes from the oral history interviews. Next slide, please. And then we also have Museum Moments, which is where we use Facebook Live to highlight little known stories from our archival collections and permanent exhibit gallery, and where different quotes from oral history interviews have also been used in some of the programs. These videos have gotten over 450 views per video on average. And we started it out during the pandemic as it being 3 days a week, and then went to 2, and now we're doing those once a week, these 15-minute programs. I think about 120 of these programs have been done so far. Next slide. So to wrap up, just take us up right up to the present here. We started last September, we joined a transcription service called Sonics, and you'll see the website address listed there on top, where we started transcribing a few of our interviews that way. And we really, this is just a example of this sample of the screen there that we use for transcriptions. And everyone on staff really seems to like doing that, because you can watch the video and correct the transcript right in the same platform. And on average, the automated transcription is about 70 to 75% accurate, which is huge and saves us a ton of time going back through oral history interviews compared to in the past when we didn't have anything. So, and the words are highlighted on you can't tell from this slide, but the words are highlighted as the video is playing, so you know exactly where you are in the transcript. And we've been able to use that for different programs as well. So that's been another new resource. And then lastly, the last slide here, I just wanted to, and I know I'm running short on time, but wanted to play a sample clip of one of our interviews, and this was done with Werner Benjamin, who is the founder of Benji's Deli. He just died earlier this year, actually, but we interviewed him in 2011, and his interview has gotten almost 1,000 views on YouTube. And I just wanted to give you a quick sense in this little clip of an encounter he had with Senator Herb Kohl when Herb Kohl was first elected to the Senate, and along with Werner Benjamin's generosity.
In Milwaukee. That includes Senator Kohl, Senator Kohl, and myself.
That's when he ran the first time.
This was when he first ran for senator, and we had a lot of. We followed for. Today's election day too, by the way.
Yeah.
Today, he was going to be elected at the time, and this is at the Fiesta Hotel, and there was a big party that night, and I got on the picture because he knew I was there, and he was talking to the audience. There were 1,000 people up there. And then he mentioned, he said, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. He said, his name is Benjamin. I didn't know he was going to do that. I'm sitting in the middle, and then everybody is saying to me, hey, I think Senator, not Senator yet, he wants you to come up on the podium. And the guy nudged me, he said, this Herbie Kohl is calling you. I said, what? So I wound up on the stage, and I got a picture, and the mayor was there, and a lot of dignitaries, and they sit down next to Mayor Norquist, I think it was at the time, and some other senators, and so it turned out. So that was one of the pictures. So.
You know, there's one question. We have to end.
Yeah, we got to.
I want to end with one last thing.
Name it.
That there's so many people that came into the deli over the years.
Yeah.
Sometimes they would order a pint of soup. You knew they needed more. They would walk away with a quart. They paid for the pint.
Yes.
There are people who didn't eat. They came. You made sure that they ate. And there were people. It was kind of a place that took care of people.
Yes.
You seem to always be happiest when you were helping other people.
I tried that. Yeah, I knew how
Is
that.
it true? Is that?
I knew how it felt not to go hungry. I knew how that felt, and I tried to do some of it. Yes, but there was a fellow, Mr. Jake Cohn. He was here. He was one of the guys that used to place some of the refugees for jobs.
The Jewish Family Service.
Jewish Family Service.
Right.
He was a friend of mine over there. He became a friend of mine because a restaurant takes people that, a lot of them don't speak English, and they speak Russian or speak a lot of, that's when the Russian
Jews came.
The Jews came to Wisconsin, to Milwaukee. So I used to get a lot of times people come in, he says, can you put them to work? I said, yeah, okay, we manage that. So that's how.
Benji, I want to really thank you for being willing to come by today.
I love to do it. And I'm sure I missed some major points, but I'm glad I'm here. And I thank Jerry very much, and I hope to see you all again.
Yes.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks so much, Jay. That was very interesting. And I know here at the History Center, we're looking at oral history projects. I'm sure we've all learned a lot from you today. So again, at this point, it's time to take another short break. So as